Good afternoon. Thank you very much. We are going to start our session two. In face of geoeconomic fragmentation, do regional monetary union provide an answer? 2 hours ago, when I entered in this building, was, as you probably know, a church, the St. Julian Church. It was built by the end of the 18th century. I remember my 11 years in the Jesuits college and seeing these, I thought that the good expression it was introibo ad altare Bretton Woods. And this is really the best way to celebrate 80 years of the Bretton Woods. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup, Bernard, for your, and George Braga de Macedo, thank you very much. I know that both of you organize all these. We are facing nowadays not only geoeconomic, but also a strong geopolitical fragmentation. As you probably know, conflicts are everywhere. In Eastern Europe, in the Middle East, in Africa. By the way, we need to remember that the longest conflict now is Sudan. Unfortunately, it's not in the telenews, but in Sudan there are 8 million displaced persons and refugees. In Sahel also, the conflicts mentioned this afternoon here. You probably don't know, but today there are 55 conflicts in the world who are affecting 2 billion people, today. Our crossroads in our day seems to be fragmentation and more polarity, confrontation but less cooperation. China, Russia, Iran, Western countries like-minded, different principles and double standards sometimes. There are a less multilateral approach in the world today. United Nations have no answers or cannot provide answers, for instance, for Ukraine or for Gaza, with heavy consequences. Heavy consequences in geoeconomics, trade restrictions against national security, sanctions, unilateral sanctions, who are weaponizing the economy and affecting 35% of the world population. We have concerns about chain supplies, but we forget sometimes that friend-shorings or near-shorings could have economic and social negative effects for the populations and for governments sometimes. All these horizons, and probably more negative ones in coming weeks or coming months, with all these, could regional monetary unions provide some answers, or at least start creating some horizons of hope? I believe that in these sections we will see the cases of Europe, Asia, and Latin America. Our first speaker today is Monsieur Hervé Carré, a French national. He was one of the architects of the European monetary system And few years ago, when Jorge Braga de Macedo was Minister of Finance, he worked for the Portuguese government as advisor of the Minister of Finance. He went back to the European Commission then as Director of Monetary Affairs and then Director overseeing the economy of the Eurozone. He works also as Minister for Economic and Financial Affairs and Development in the European Commission delegation embassy in Washington. And his last position were Deputy Director of the ECOFIN and Director General of Eurostat. Monsieur Hervé Carré, the European Union, Monetary Union, known sometimes in the media as Eurozone, is probably not yet a real economic and monetary union. And it seems that this is not a priority sometimes in Brussels, at least a political priority. But, and that's one of the questions, the EU example, the EU case could be a template, could be a basic model for other regional integrations in Africa, in Asia, or in Latin America, because sometimes these countries are looking in different directions, sometimes looking for the dollar, sometimes looking for multi-currency reserves, like it was underlined a few minutes ago here. The European model will be a good one, even if it's created step by step.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll try to answer. I'm not sure we'll succeed. Anyway, I wanted to give you some short remarks about Portugal and European monetary integration during 2 years of financial crisis. There are lessons to be drawn from this crisis, 92-93. As you know, in January 1992, the Maastricht Treaty was signed in Lisbon, by the way, setting up the roadmap to the adoption of single currency by 1999. Shortly after, in April 92, the Portuguese authorities decided to fix the escudo within the exchange rate mechanism of the EMS and to use this exchange rate mechanism link as an instrument to foster convergence, which means reducing public sector borrowing requirement, reducing public debt, reducing inflation, the whole program. But after the 80s, years of deregulations marked by the full liberalization of capital movement, the dismantling of exchange control, and the absence of any oversight of the bank's internal position, maybe major point, it was easy for operators on the capital markets to take positions against the currency they choose because they found it weak. They would borrow this currency, convert it immediately into Deutsche Mark, which was at the time the anchor currency of the system, and then await for the weekend realignment, which would enable them to make a huge profit with revalued Deutsche Mark. This is the scenario which was repeated in the crisis 92-93. In September 16, the sterling pound and the Italian lira had to leave the ER, the exchange rate mechanism, after strong speculative attacks. And the Spanish peseta was devalued by 5%. On 23 November of the same year, the Spanish peseta and the Portuguese escudo were devalued again by 6%. On 3 January 1993, the UK authorities decided not to rejoin the exchange rate mechanism. It was the beginning of the Brexit, in fact. On 14th of May, the Spanish peseta and Portuguese escudo were devalued by 8 and 6.5%. On 2nd of August, after strong speculative attacks, it was always the same scenario repeated, but this time attacks on the French franc, the exchange rate mechanism fluctuation band is widened to plus or minus 15% instead of plus or minus 225. This measure restored calm on the markets. It was clear that realignment would have to be made, would be made within the 30% fluctuation bound. One-way bets for operators disappeared. With calm restored on the market, the Portuguese authorities took the opportunity to launch an international bond issue, $1 billion US, 1,000 million US dollars. This bond issue was very easily solved. This was the market recognition that Portugal was on track to adopt the single currency according to the Maastricht Treaty. To conclude this very short resume, I would like to thank the officials in the Bank of Portugal and in the Ministry of Finance, which I met 30 years ago, and some of them are today here. They were remarkably competent and they helped me a lot. Congratulations to all of them. To answer your last question, I think it is time to complete the monetary union. The capital market union is not yet effective. And in particular, I think the oversight of the bank's external position should be centralized. This is my feeling. As a first step, then full capital market union. Then, is it a lesson for other countries? I think so, but I'm not qualified to answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Hervé. Our second speaker of today is Professor Anup Singh. Professor Anup Singh is an Indian national, and he was director of the Western Hemisphere Department and director of the Asia Pacific Department in the International Monetary Fund, and then special advisor to the governor of the Reserve Bank of India, professor at Georgetown University, and more recently member of the Fiscal Commission of India. Professor Singh, Asia Monetary Cooperation example is still the Chiang Mai initiative, or there are other examples of currency or monetary cooperation. Economic integration is growing in Asia, for instance, with the Asian Economic Community, and the new development bank of the BRICS could be also an example. We don't know exactly when we talk about the BRICS, if we talk about the original BRICS or the current one, because economic and politically are two completely different realities. But do you think Asian APEC are more economic community than monetary one, but could be starting points, or there are other starting points in Asia. And do you think, Professor, there are enough political and economic solidarity among member states of these organizations, or even in the Asian countries who allowed the creation of a future monetary union?
Thank you very much. You've asked me a number of questions, and I will try to get to them in due course. Before coming here, I met some friends, and I said I'm going to give a talk at 80 years of the Bretton Woods. So they said, what's so important about 80 years? So I thought about it. I said, well, 80 years is very important. They asked me why. So that made me think a little bit more of what Michel Camdessou has told me. He has told me often in the last 6 months, we are at a historic impasse in a number of ways. He mentions to me a growth impasse, which we are. But let me begin by making the following point. It is possible that at 80 years, we are in an actual crisis in terms of fundamentals that affect the global financial safety net. Now we know, as we mentioned before today, this safety net has a number of layers. You've got the IMF, you've got the bilaterals, you've got hopefully regional, you've got reserves, and so on. But my issue is now this. I have a sense we are in a sense of crisis that we've not seen before. And before we start looking at the incremental changes to address the problem, such as the regional monetary arrangements and others, let's look at the fundamentals. Now, what do I mean? So, I mean two things. We know that global public debt today is at a historic high. It's important to remember that is for two different reasons, right? Most importantly, this rising debt trend to historic levels is because of the major players, the United States and China, and advanced countries. And their debt ratios are now well above 120% of GDP. And last week, the IMF produced predictions for the next 5 years that showed that the US general government debt ratio will remain well above where we were before the pandemic. So the point is, we are again entering a situation like we did 2 years ago, when we saw flash faults of liquidity. We saw that 2 years ago when the US got downgraded, and there were flash points of liquidity crises. I think that could happen again. So we're down to global liquidity as a possible crisis as to where we are now, because of the situation of the largest debtors, especially the United States, where any week now there could be another downgrade in its creditworthiness and the refusal to honor the debt. That's number one. Equally, with the advanced countries, emerging markets debts are high. It will not take long for a few leading emerging markets to have problems with repayment, which could spiral further, and we could be facing another debt crisis at emerging markets issue. So the issue is twofold. This is happening at a time when we don't have a global financial safety net. We don't have an institution that is consciously monitoring global liquidity and dealing with it. And we don't have a global lender of last resort. Now, you may argue we don't need a global lender of last resort, but we have seen over the years the other, let's say the first lender of resort, the bilaterals, as we saw in 2008, they don't work except for those countries that are drawn into that group of countries to which the bilaterals apply. I know that in 2008, India tried, for example, to ask the US, can we be part of your swap deals? And the US said no. Our swaps are only intended to currencies where safe global dollar assets are a problem. India is not part of that. So we saw that these bilaterals don't really work. Now, what I'm trying to say is this. I'm trying to say, let's relook at the fundamentals. Okay, let's look at global liquidity. And now look at the IMF. Now, let's look at the IMF's mandate. I'm not saying it can change tomorrow, but just look at its mandate. The mandate of the IMF, which is well recognized in its mandate, is that it has a monitoring responsibility over movements in the current account balances. As you may know, the IMF does not have a monitoring responsibility over movements in the capital account. And that's a mandate issue. Now, it's not simply a question of changing the mandate, because that will require constitutional change. It will need to amend what is called Article 6 of the IMF's Articles of Agreement. If you amend that and you give the IMF the constitutional authority for monitoring capital accounts that includes global liquidity, it is one step forward. But that amendment is not going to work because the IMF will need the instruments to manage liquidity, such as the SDR, which it does not yet have. So the point is, if we have to get back to fundamentals, not only do we have to change the mandate of the IMF to give them the responsibility for the capital account balances and therefore global liquidity, they also need an instrument to manage it with. That's number one. The second point is the so-called lender of last resort, which we spoke about very often this morning and this afternoon. Now, you may argue there are other systems, other institutions, but the IMF is the only mechanism, the only institution, the only body that is meant to be a lender of last resort. It is not, but it is meant to be. Now, why is it not a lender of last resort? In this sense, well, this comes back to my final point and that is the issue is one of governance. By governance, what do I mean? So all of you have followed what's happening with the debt of important emerging markets, important developing countries, where the principal creditor is not a member of the Paris Club. It is China. I saw close hand for 18 months why the IMF's role with these countries like Sri Lanka last year simply could not work because it could not put together a debt resolution, which is a requirement for the IMF to have a program. So if you are in a situation where debt resolution is not possible more generally because you have different creditors and they are not part of the same game plan. We have a big problem. Because even if you give the IMF some more tools to be a lender of last resort, if it can't get the debt resolution, which took, I think, 15 months for Sri Lanka and a number of more countries you have heard about, unless we deal with that aspect on the debt resolution, the IMF cannot be a lender of last resort, and there isn't another institution or body or system. So we hope that in the meanwhile, the regional monetary arrangements may work. We hope the bilaterals may work. My simple answer to that is they have not. Now, if you look at the BRICS, and the BRICS try to establish what they call a CRA, a contingent reserve asset, not that long ago, in 2014-15, which is part of the BRICS attempt to have a new development bank, which is more like the World Bank, let's leave it at the side, and then a contingent reserve asset, which is meant to be like a small IMF. Now, I don't need to go into why that has not worked and why it will not work. All I can tell you is, a friend of mine who was the executive director for Brazil at the IMF some years ago, Paulo Nogueira Batista, you may know him. He has just brought out a newish book, not new, it was 2 years old, in which he tries to describe how the BRICS try to put together these institutions, how the BRICS try to establish this contingent reserve asset, and he says in the book why it didn't work. Now, why didn't it work? That's my final point. These monetary arrangements, certainly the BRICS CRA, but maybe others too, depend on central banks. In the BRICS case, it depended entirely on the central banks. The last thing that the Central Bank of Brazil wanted to do, even though it was the creator of the CRA, the last thing the Central Bank of Brazil wanted to do is to get into any arrangement whereby Brazil will give a swap to any of the other five without an IMF program. They simply would not agree. And the other central banks, by and large, agreed. So central banks, I'm trying to point out, including the Fed and the Fed's bilateral swap, these central banks have their own mandates. And that mandate is not a lender of first resort, a lender of medium resort, or a lender of last resort. So we have a crisis in that we are on the verge of a debt crisis affecting both global liquidity from the US and emerging market debt. And we don't have the institutions of a global financial safety net that we have designed 80 years ago. So maybe now the time has come to try to go back to the fundamentals and try to see how we can restore or add amendments and mandates to the original institutions to make them work. That's my point.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you. I'm sure that what you remember was about the fundamentals and also the BRICS and the limitation of the BRICS and the role of the central banks could be a good framework for questions and for our talks after these, after the first round. Now we are going to listen someone from Latin America, but in video. Professor Renato Flores already spoke about Latin America problems, not only, but also about Latin American problems. Let's see, we are going to listen El Señor José Antonio Campo. he was Minister of Finance of Colombia, and previously he was Minister for Agriculture and Rural Development of Colombia, and he was also working in the United Nations Under Secretary General for Economic and Social Affairs and the Economic Commission for Latin America and Caribbean. And he is also, he was Director of International and Public Affairs Institute of the Columbia University. We are going to see the video he registered for us. I don't know if you answer the questions could be put it in Latin America, but mainly economic integration in Central and South America is still building up. There is a lot of political and economic fragmentations today in Latin America, especially in the last years, and this creates vulnerabilities. The problem is what could be the solution for Latin America. If they look at the dollar, they look at reserves in several currencies, as Professor Renato Flores pointed out. Let's see what El Señor Ocampo had to tell us, if we can look the video now.
Participate in this meeting on the regional monetary system. Let me thank all the three organizers, and I'm very happy that I am back with the Robert Triffin Foundation to collaborate in this task. The important thing to emphasize in relation to regional monetary institutions is that in contrast to the system of multilateral development banks, the international monetary system essentially lacks a significant number of regional institutions. In the multilateral development banks, aside from the World Bank Group, we have regional banks for all developing country regions, and actually we have two new banks. We have headquartered in China. But in the international monetary system, we essentially have only, let's say, I think 3 institutions and one for which I have some questions. Those 3 institutions are, of course, the European Stability Mechanism, which is by far the largest, which was created during the Euro crisis. And of course, you will discuss it widely in your meeting. The second mechanism is the Chiang Mai Initiative. It was created during the Asian financial crisis, but then reformed during the this 2007-2009 crisis, which I call it North Atlantic crisis. And it was expanded significantly. It's a system of swaps, but in the 2009 reform, the swaps became were broadened and multilateralized. Previously, there were essentially bilateral swap arrangements. And the third mechanism is actually the one that we have in Latin America, the Latin American Reserve Fund, which is actually the development in 1989 of the 1978 Andean Development Fund, which had played actually a very, very useful role during the debt crisis of Latin America. This is an institution that beyond the Andean countries now has other members in order, I think, of historical joining the organization. They are Uruguay, Costa Rica, Paraguay, and actually Chile, who rejoined after having left in the late 1970s. This is, let me say, a very useful mechanism, although it's a small institution. It has a balance of payment support, liquidity financing, which are essentially one-year loans, and also debt restructuring financing. Basically, gives countries which are on the debt restructuring some lending facilities. I perhaps emphasize it because it's the institution from my part of the world, and I think it's very good. I mean, hopefully, the largest Latin American countries, Brazil and Mexico, will join, and other Latin American countries. Let me say that the fourth institution is the Arab Monetary Fund. This institution, however, when you look at how it lends, it looks more like a multilateral development bank and even a trade financing institution, rather than a monetary institution. So the monetary role of the institution may be questioned. Now, I think it's very important to develop a network of regional monetary institutions to really complement the International Monetary Fund as a network of institutions, the similar system that we have in the multilateral development banks. And finally, let me say that I have made for a long time a recommendation to support the creation of these regional monetary arrangements, which is essentially that the contributions of developing countries to this regional monetary institution should be considered as part of the base on which special drawing rights are granted, so that that will generate a significant incentive to create these new institutions. I hope you have a fantastic meeting. I'm sorry I cannot be in person for other commitment that I have, and thanks very much for the invitation.
I'm sure that the statement of Professor Ocampo will raise some questions among us. Now we have another video. Unfortunately, Professor Andrew Sheng was not able to come also. I would like to remember that he is a Hong Kong-based Malaysian banker. Professor Sheng served as Deputy Chief Executive of the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, Chairman of the Hong Kong Security and Future Commission, President of the Fung Global Institute, and recently he was Chief Advisor of the China Banking Regulatory Commission. I'm sure that it could raise some issues related to monetary integration possibilities in Asia, and hopefully speak a little bit about China. The problem is that if China in a political point of view, want to be an example to what we call now, at least some countries of the Global South. I don't like very much the expression of Global South. It's an expression probably for the media, but this exists, or at least an example to the BRICS. I propose that we can see the video and the statement of Professor Sheng.
Good morning, everyone. I want to thank Michel Camdesou and Bernard Snoy for inviting me to this very important conference on the Bretton Woods, 80 years after Bretton Woods, relaunching multilateralism through regional monetary unions. Due to the shortness of time, I will stick very quickly to the key issues at hand. First, I think I want to pay tribute to Hervé Anoun and Peter Ditters on the prescient 2017 comment on why the global financial system remains fragile, the difficulties of recovery, climate change, digitalization, globalization, geopolitical turbulences, and why people are angry. Now, the 5 questions that Bernard has asked me to answer was, under what conditions could economic and monetary unions be successful? And secondly, question 2 and 3 is the monetary cooperation in Asia, and the Chiang Mai Initiative. And then 4, which most people are interested in, whether China is working to build its own monetary zone. And then finally, some comments on de-dollarization and its implications for the international monetary system. Now, first of all, we need to understand that the geopolitics of money is that it's really empire-driven. Empires, the hegemon in the empire have exorbitant privilege of reserve currency creation, which, as the Robert Triffin identified, is that it creates increasing debt. And the stronger state can lead the monetary union, provided it underwrites its public goods. Now, since when Bretton Woods was formed in 1945-47, America was very generous in providing global public goods through financing, the Marshall Plan, running current account deficits so that Europe, Japan, and the rest of the world can recover. But, it basically ran what I call the Wall Street hedge fund models borrowed from the British, in which it can borrow through issuing long-term US treasuries at, somewhere between 0 to 4% per annum, and then use the proceeds to re-lend or invest back in emerging markets and the rest of the world at a higher ROE, the hedge fund leverage model. Unfortunately, the system, which allows the United States to have an exorbitant currency privilege, leads to a greater and greater debt for the system. And the current G7, led model is that global debt has reached 238% of global GDP. G7 countries' average debt is 120% of GDP. And 39 out of 69 low-income countries are in or near debt distress. And of course, the US Congressional Budget Office, based on current US fiscal and trade deficits, or particularly fiscal deficits, which is already as high as the peak in World War II, is going to probably 150% of GDP by 2048, if not earlier. Now, let me, address the key question of successful monetary unions in general. In a very tight or full monetary union, all members adopt a single monetary policy, a common currency, single external exchange rate, as well as absence of exchange controls. Now, the ECB, or rather the Euro system, which you all know better than me, requires also a unified capital market, integrated fiscal policies, and integration of different political views, which makes it currently a work in progress. What the IMF calls pseudo monetary unions, like the Gulf Cooperation Council, is members agreeing to maintain fixed exchange rates amongst members without explicit integration of economic policy and separate foreign exchange reserves, different central banks, and monetary policies. But all monetary unions ultimately depend on one super body or lead member to be the lender of last resort or underwriter of losses within the union. And that makes the burden on that hegemon very, very heavy. Now, let me very quickly, answer the question on monetary integration in Asia. Well, Asia basically operates on variable geometry, trade integration with no monetary union. Before the Asian financial crisis in 1997-98, Asian currencies were roughly linked with each other fairly tightly. And after the Asian financial crisis, currencies were floated against the dollar, reserve increased, and bank supervision tightened. Now, the Chiang Mai Initiative was essentially a central bank swap arrangements whereby the larger central banks like Bank of Japan and People's Bank of China would be able to swap with other members in the event of need. But remember, the Chiang Mai initiative has never been operationalized because one of the conditions is that members who draw upon this facility would be subject to IMF conditionality. And the only surveillance issue that was agreed upon was AMRO, which is the ASEAN Plus 3 Macroeconomic Research Office, which is now operational. In my view, monetary integration in Asia suffers from the lack of development of stock markets and long-term pension funds and institutional funds, which are able to deleverage the growing debt burden which arose after the Asian, because after the Asian crisis, there was a move to push more long-term bond markets and local bonds, local currency bonds, forgetting that even local currency bonds can be subject to speculative attacks. Now, let me go into this very interesting question about RMB internationalization. My view is that actually when Zhou Xiaochuan, the People's Bank governor, made the statement in 2009, there was no intention for RMB to have its own monetary zone. It was very clear that the desirable goal of reforming the international monetary system is to create an international reserve currency that is disconnected from individual nations and is able to remain stable and remove the deficiencies caused by using credit-based national currencies. So the reform should be grand vision and specific deliverables and a gradual process that yields win-win results. And in 2022, in the latest 20th Party Congress, they just simply said we will promote internationalization of renminbi, involve in the global industrial division of labor and cooperation, and preserve the diversity and stability of the international economic landscape and economic and trade relations. So why is the US dollar so difficult to dislodge? And the answer is it took the US 70 years, according to Barry Eichengreen, to replace the pound sterling. The US economy was already larger in GDP than the British Empire in 1870, and the US dollar did not replace sterling until it developed its internal interbank market, foreign exchange market, stock market, and created the Federal Reserve System, so that and its stock markets. So it was a long time before there was sufficient power to maintain its role as the reserve currency status. Now, even the People's Bank of China, which publishes an annual cross-border RMB index, it showed that the United States is leading with 58.3%, Euro at 22.2%, and RMB only at less than 3.2%. And the RMB's share of SDR and global FX reserves are still small. So, given the fact that the Chinese economy is less than roughly 2/3 of the GDP of the United States, even though it is the largest trading nation, payments alone does not mean that the renminbi will replace the US dollar anytime soon. Now, the latest paper by Goldman Sachs on de-dollarization showed that the talk about de-dollarization accelerated after the G7 sanctions on Russia in 2022. But in terms of the percentage of US shares of US dollar assets as a share of global portfolio investment, that has tended to increase rather than decrease. Now, the reason for people talk about de-dollarization is really due to sanctions. And of course, 29% of global trade is under some form of sanctions, and 40% of the energy producers are under sanctions, And the US has imposed 2/3 of such sanctions on more than 20 countries. And as a result, supply chains are being decoupled, and people who do not want to be subject to sanctions or freezing or confiscation of their dollar or euro or American ally assets, therefore are thinking about payment systems that do not use the dollar. Now, what are the possibilities of this? Well, the CBDC, the central bank, the digital currency pilots by the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, Bank of Thailand, Central Bank of United Arab Emirates, and People's Bank of China, has gone past the pilot stage. And in my view, the next stage of development will be netting systems rather than using real-time gross settlement systems. And if they are settled through using CBDC or stable coins, without touching the dollar or euro or any of the G7 currencies, the particularly members of that payments mechanism rather than the monetary union may be able to escape sanctions. So let me conclude. What are the alternatives to the dollar? Well, in theory and ideally, as the Robert Triffin International recommends, it should be the SDR or a non-national currency. Now, gold has always been thought of as an alternative, but the gold reserves still remain relatively small in size. But gold prices have reached $2,400 per ounce recently, and for many investors, it is attractive because it has no counterparty risks. If you hold gold, provided it does not get stolen or seized, the assets cannot, be seized if it's physically with you. Now, in my personal view, cyber currencies may not survive a nuclear war or a severe disruption of the internet, because in a conventional warfare, as some people have realized, you can cut all the fiber optic cables, satellite disruptions, or energy failures through complete disruptions of supplies of energy or destruction of the power sources. So, Bitcoin, how would you be able to assess Bitcoin if something like that happens? So my bottom line conclusion is that for the foreseeable future, given the primacy of the United States in military, technology, finance terms, the US dollar status is for the US to lose, not easily for others to gain. I hope that means that the international monetary system cannot be reformed without the implicit or explicit consent of the United States. And the current Cold War or geopolitical tensions, it is probably within the next 5 years or so unlikely to get a major agreement amongst the major shareholders of the Bretton Woods institutions to do substantive international monetary system reforms. However, there is no reason why we should not have very active debate and discussion at the academic level on why the reforms should be made. On that note, thank you very much. And if there are any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me at the email that I have put. Thank you so very much for your attention.
Yeah. Yes. Well, very interesting presentation of Professor Schenk, really. If you allow me, I would like to open the debate now and asking if you had questions to to our speakers, and also if you'd like to comment the two presentations of Professor Ocampo and Professor Jorge Braga de Macedo, please.
Thank you. This is a point of order which I feel I should make right now. There was already a mention of the community of Portuguese-speaking countries, and there are several here that are from such countries, of course, including Portugal. The sessions tomorrow will include Africa and then Latin America and Asia. In Latin America, of course, Brazil, the giant, and Timor, the minuscule. And then, of course, there are a number of African countries. It seemed to me that it was important to also talk about this country, and to do so by taking advantage of the word geopolitical within the European Union. And the episode that Hervé Carré mentioned is not the only one where this is relevant. It turns out that he was also involved in the second one. So allow me to just explain in a way, how is it that what you did here, dear Hervé, was geopolitical? Portugal had, from the moment it entered the European community, with the experience of EFTA, but of course without the weight in Europe that Spain has. Spain is a permanent guest of the G20. It's the only country that is in that situation. And so the fact that the government of Spain was very quick in stabilizing the exchange rate of the peseta made it, to the mind of the government at the time, absolutely essential that we follow suit. And so there are the two examples, aside from the one that Hervé mentioned, but in both, he was involved as an official of the European community. When Spain was entering in the European monetary system, since they did it before, it was in a way easier for Portugal to follow, but it had to follow. And there was less of a reputation, because of course Spain had done it during its presidency, which was slightly before our own. And so I was fortunate to have in the Ministry of Finance a number of very able people led by who else but Hervé Carré. So this was absolutely crucial because we didn't expect that there would be a crisis as what happened right after the signature of the treaty with the crisis of the Eurozone. So it was very important to be able to show credibility very quickly. Now, is that geopolitical? Not in a way, but in another way it is. And what is the second example that brought Hervé back to Portugal as an official of the European Commission? It was the Troika. And there you had an extremely interesting example of what happened in Portugal that has been called by, in an article by a colleague of mine, two colleagues of mine, António Pinto Barbosa and Luís Catela Nunes, the peculiar first semester of 2012. Before Mario Draghi's speech in London, before the first semester, his speech was in July, the first semester was until June. The spreads of the Portuguese bonds relative to the others, the Germans, were down, were going down, they were calm. And therefore, when he did it, we will do everything, and believe me, it will be enough, Portugal was already, in a certain way, financially speaking, out of the woods. The message had to be provided by competent agents. One of them is in this room. But the fact of the matter is that this particular geopolitical problem of Portugal relative to, in that case, not so much Spain, but Greece, and even Italy was essential. So I wanted to bring this. I hope, Hervé, you will also provide your own view. But from my view, as policymaker on the one side and as advisor to the government before the Troika, and therefore, very much in touch with the three institutions that were here, not just the Commission, but also the European Central Bank and the IMF, I can say that this was the crucial element that the Troika helped, or it didn't, we don't know, but it started by putting our own house financially in order, and that worked out very well. I hope I didn't speak for too long, but more than that, I hope you understood that this is part of geopolitical, and that the program remains, il est entier. In other words, I did not go away from the problem of geopolitical, but it's just two neighboring countries in the southwest of Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Ragat-Masset. Thank you very much to remember interesting moments of our recent history. Other question, please?
Yeah, I would like to follow up from Andrew Shang's remark on his video presentation. He said that cyber currency like CBDC cannot be a reserve currency because it would disappear in a nuclear war or disruption of the internet. I want to leverage from that to make the comment that the SDR, since many of us has mentioned the SDR as a potential, desirable, neutral international reserve currency, to keep in mind that SDR, the way it is organized now and the way it is used now, is nothing more than the unit of account representing claims on the currency of the 5 countries whose currency make up the SDR. Now, if we have a worst-case scenario of geopolitical conflict, it's a low probability, but one good thing of a case where those 5 countries refuse to accept SDR from the rest of the world for their national currencies, which are the only currency that can be spent. SDR cannot be spent. If we have that situation, then the current stock of SDR, almost $1 trillion US, disappear overnight. And therefore, SDR, the way it is organized now and used now, can never be a reserve currency, not even a currency, let alone reserve currency. And therefore, I have sympathy with the aspiration to develop, like Robert Triffin said many years ago, or Zhao Sichuan said recently, developing an international reserve currency independent of any national authorities to be used for the global economy. I support that sentiment and that aspiration. But I think that we should be very careful and precise when we say, oh, we should use the SDR as the international reserve currency.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Please, sir, your neighbor.
Thank you. Just a clarification, in my case at least, when I am talking about SDR, I am not talking about a basket currency, which is not a currency at all, as my colleague already explained. SDR is not a currency, is not a reserve. But what we are, at least in Robert Triffin International, advocating is to transform this basket into a genuine reserve currency, a multilateral one. It's technically very easy. It's just letting IMF to buy to central bank of the world eligible national bonds, and against that to issue the counterpart in SDR. No cost at all. The only problem is that we have to change IMF status, and there the hegemon up to now disagree. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Any more question? Please, our friend from Bulgaria.
Hello, my name is Vasil Krajunov. I'm from Bulgaria, Bulgarian section of ELEC. Just a comment, as all the discussions I've seen here, I am with the idea that we must change first our mind, because whether it is SDR or any other type of reserve currency, everybody is measuring it in US dollars. SDRs, we have the stock of SDRs is 1 billion, whatever, 1 trillion, whatever. The other thing, whether it is blockchain based or any other type of currency based, is measured again in US dollars. As long as you measure anything in US dollars, the US dollars is the only reserve currency. And also bear in mind that US government has big debt, 35 trillion as of today, but about half of it is owned by Federal Reserve and other US government or state authorities. So only a little portion is owned by foreign countries. It is around 15%. And in the same time, in Europe, it was really interesting, the previous section, when there was a big emphasis on the lack of liquidity in US dollars, the global liquidity as a whole, and that Europe, we need US access to liquidity in US dollars. But in the same time, Europe, the Eurozone, has a net deficit every year in US dollars. What I mean, the export minus the import, which is invoiced and paid in US dollars, is on the negative side, and it is around 8% of GDP of the whole Eurozone. So we put more and more and more deficit in US dollars every year. And in the same time, we're looking for assets, liquidity in US, which is kind of insane for me, but I don't understand it. So there is no, as long as we think in dollar terms for SDRs or whatever, there is no need to use anything as a reserve currency. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any more questions? Before giving the floor to our debates, let me just say that it's fascinating to be here, because there is, of course, a common ground in this room, but the perception of different geographies are fascinating, at least for me. It reminds me, this politician of the 19th century used to say, in politics, we can change everything except geography. Let's give the floor to our speakers. Monsieur Carré. No?
I don't want to add.
Professor Singh.
Unfortunately, some believe geography can be changed too. That's a joke.
Sometimes.
I'll just make one comment on the STR, Bernard, if I may. We have talked about this. You're all right in saying the STR is not really functioning widely. But people have been working on what to do. And you may or may not have seen, there's an important proposal which has been put forward by the Inter-American Development Bank and the African Development Bank. It's been there for at least 2 or 3 years. But I think privately, I think this is taking effect, and I think may move ahead. Their proposal is quite simple, but also quite historic. Simple because they're saying advanced countries have SDRs, they don't use them. We know that. Why don't you let the advanced countries give the SDRs, a small amount, to a new institution? And please know we can't allow that, because if you do that to another institution, the SDR might lose its characteristic, which is very important, of a reserve asset. A reserve asset means its value can never be compromised under any conditions. But they have found out a way in which this can be done without compromising the reserve asset status of the SDR. So it is possible. Now I know that in the last 2-3 months, France, very importantly, the UK, very importantly, a number of shareholders have politically supported the move, which does not require any constitutional change by the IMF. So if this goes ahead, it will be small but historic, because it will allow some countries to give the SDRs to a new institution without losing its reserve asset status, but by doing so, that new institution could use it carefully as an equity to raise market finance. Small but historic if it happens.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Singh. Well, I think we finish our session of this afternoon. I would like, just as Jorge Braga de Macedo said, to remind the presence of our friends of CPLP, who are very important for us. And just to remember that we are here in this meeting to talk about regional monetary cooperation and regional monetary unions. And we'll follow tomorrow in the Academy of Science. The president is among us, and I'm sure he will welcome us so well as Bank of Portugal today, which I thank again the welcome of Bank of Portugal. But just to remind that we need to talk a little more about regional monetary union, because if not, it reminds me this German general used to say, there is no battle plan resist to the first contact with the enemy. So we need to talk a little bit tomorrow more about regional monetary union. Well, thank you very much for your presence. Thank you for our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And so we finished the first working session, but we still have dinner, and actually cocktail will be served upstairs. So we'll be following our protocol, the head of our protocol unit, for that component to end the day in the best possible way as well. And thank you all for your participation.